Acquiring a business? BizNexus simplifies it. Access thousands of updated opportunities in our DIY marketplace or supercharge team sourcing with OmniSource, your all-in-one platform for on-market, off-market, and coming-soon deals. Scale smarter today. Learn more or book a demo at www.biznexus.com.
Disclaimer from the always present legal team. Podcast conversations don't necessarily reflect the views of BizNexus Incorporated. Everything you hear is informational news and updates from around the industry. We're not recommending any investments. We're not offering any investment advice. Be sure to do your own homework.
Welcome to the deep dive. You know, when you think about big business deals, mergers, acquisitions, well, the headlines always grab onto the big picture stuff, right? The strategy, market share, who's in charge.
Absolutely, the flashy parts.
But sometimes, maybe often, the thing that really decides if a deal works out isn't in those headlines at all. It's kind of hidden away in the technical details, the stuff that hits the bottom line later on.
That's so true. It's about what value you actually end up keeping versus, what just sort of leaks away quietly. The foundation, really.
Exactly. And that foundation is what we're digging into today. We've been looking at some really insightful material, specifically on tax structuring and planning for M&A deals.
A critical area.
These insights come from Ravi Manga. He's an international tax partner and M&A expert at Valuecent Consultancy PVT Ltd. So a big thank you to Ravi and Valuecent for sharing this with us.
Yeah, it's fantastic stuff because this area can genuinely make or break the economics of a deal. But often it gets looked at way too late.
Right. So our mission here is to unpack why tax isn't just, a compliance chore you do at the end, why it's actually fundamental to building a smart deal that maximizes value. We want to look at the risks, the potential rewards, the practical ways to handle it all based on these sources so you can get the essentials.
It's like the silent deal maker or breaker sometimes.
Totally.
Yeah.
So we'll touch on what the hidden value or cost side of tax, navigating the global legal maze.
Yeah, the structuring techniques themselves, maybe a real-world example to make it concrete.
And definitely flag some common pitfalls, right? The mistakes that cost companies.
For sure. There are a few big ones.
Okay, sounds crucial. Let's dive in. So why is tax strategy such a big deal in M&A? It feels like something the accountants just tidy up after the main deal is done.
That's a really common view. And honestly, it's a costly one. The core idea in these sources is simple. Every single M&A deal carries significant tax consequences. They're baked right into the structure.
And these aren't small potatoes we're talking.
No, not at all. These can be huge. We're talking about potentially massive shifts in value, either preserving it or, frankly, destroying it, depending on how you handle the tax side.
So it hits the deal's real profitability.
Fundamentally.
Yeah.
Yeah. It touches everything. I mean, right from the start, how do you even buy the company? Do you buy its shares or do you buy its assets? That choice alone has huge tax ripples. And then it affects everything downstream, too.
Yeah.
How you move profits around later, how you deal with intellectual property, especially across borders, all of it.
Right. So the main goal isn't just finding the lowest tax rate somewhere. It's more about building the transaction itself in a way that's, tax smart and safe.
That's exactly it. The sources really hammer this home. The objective is to preserve the value you think you're buying. You want to minimize those nasty surprises,
Correct.
unexpected tax bills popping up later, and you need to make sure that the return on investment, the ROI you calculated when you modeled the deal, that it doesn't get eaten away by tax costs you didn't plan for.
It's like the deal looks great on closing day, but 5 years later you realize a huge chunk of the profit just evaporated into taxes because the structure wasn't right.
Precisely. The material is crystal clear on this. Tax in M&A is a powerful lever, a value lever. Get it right, and you can literally add millions to shareholder value.
Wow.
But ignore it, treat it like an afterthought. It can silently kill the deal's economics. And this matters just as much, maybe even more, when you're talking about smaller deals like in the lower middle market. Every bit of value preservation is critical there.
That really reframes it. It's not just compliance, it's strategic value creation. But, okay, navigating the actual tax laws.
Yeah.
That sounds like a nightmare, especially internationally.
It is. It's a seriously complex environment,
Yeah.
and it's always changing. You've got this web of global tax rules all trying to prevent companies from being overly aggressive with tax avoidance. The sources highlight a few key things you just have to understand.
Like double tax treaties. I know they help avoid paying tax twice, right?
Yeah, basically. There are agreements between two countries. They decide who gets to tax, what kind of income, dividends, interest, royalties, that sort of thing. And crucially, they often lower the withholding tax rates on those payments moving between the countries. Super important for cross-border deals.
Okay.
Then you've got things like controlled foreign corporation rules, CFC rules. Lots of countries have these. They essentially allow the home country to tax certain kinds of income earned by a company's foreign subsidiaries now, even if the cash hasn't been brought back home yet.
So they stop companies just leaving profits sitting in some low-tax place forever.
Pretty much. It prevents indefinite deferral, especially on passive income. And then there's the really big international push, BEPS, base erosion and profit shifting.
Heard of that one.
Oh.
OECD initiative.
That's the one. Coordinated effort to stop companies from exploiting gaps between different countries' tax systems to shift profits, away from where the real economic activity is happening.
And parking them somewhere with low tax and maybe not much else going on.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
Shifting profits to places with little economic substance. BEPS aims to align taxing rights with substance.
Makes sense. Closing loopholes.
Right. And alongside that, you see countries beefing up their own domestic rules. Things like GAAR general anti-avoidance rules, often paired now with something called the principal purpose test, or PPT.
Okay, what do those do?
Basically, they give tax authorities a powerful tool. They can look at a transaction or a structure, and even if it technically follows the letter of the law, if they decide its main purpose or sole purpose was just to get a tax benefit without a good underlying business reason.
They can just disregard it, challenge it.
Yes, they can deny the tax benefit. It puts a huge emphasis on having genuine commercial reasons for your structure.
So across all these different rules treaties, CFC, BEPS, GAR, the big theme seems to be economic substance. Your tax setup has to match your actual business reality.
That is absolutely the name of the game now. If your structure feels artificial, if it lacks real substance, real people making real decisions, conducting real business activities in that location, it's just asking for trouble. It's incredibly vulnerable. Ignoring substance is probably the biggest risk out there today.
Okay, so given that really complex legal picture, how do you actually do it? How do you structure a deal to navigate all this effectively? What are the practical levers?
Well, the sources get into the key decisions, and maybe the most fundamental one right at the start is choosing between an asset deal or a share deal.
And that's not just legal stuff, it has major tax impacts.
Huge tax impacts. In an asset deal, the buyer is basically picking specific assets, maybe a factory, some patents, customer lists, and maybe assuming certain liabilities. The big potential tax win for the buyer here is they can often step up the tax basis of those assets to what they paid for them, meaning they can often claim higher depreciation deductions against those assets in the future, which lowers their taxable income. Good for the buyer. But for the seller, selling individual assets might trigger tax at different, possibly higher rates compared to selling shares.
Okay. And a share deal.
In a share deal, the buyer buys the whole company, stock and all. Usually, the tax basis of the assets inside that company doesn't change just because the ownership changed. The seller typically pays capital gains tax on selling their shares, which might be lower than the tax on selling assets directly. Plus, you have to think about other things like goodwill treatment and whether the company being sold has tax losses you can use later. It's all different depending on asset versus share.
Wow. So that first choice really changes the tax math for everyone involved. Could definitely affect the price. What else is key?
Definitely designing the deal funding mix. How's the buyer paying? Cash? Issuing new shares? Borrowing money? Some combination.
Yep.
That mix really matters for things like whether the interest paid on any debt used is tax deductible. And it can affect withholding taxes if money's moving across borders to fund the deal.
Right. And the third technique mentioned was holding company structures.
Yes, that's a classic tool, especially for international deals. You set up a new company, a holding company, often in a country that has good tax treaties and favorable rules for holding investments. The sources mention places like the Netherlands or Singapore as common examples.
And the buyer uses that company to actually buy the target.
Exactly. So the acquisition chain might look like parent company, holding company, target company.
And this loops right back to that economic substance point you made earlier, doesn't it?
Absolutely critical. It's non-negotiable. You can't just set up an empty shell company in a favorable jurisdiction anymore. Those days are gone. That holding company needs real substance. It needs actual people holding real board meetings, making real decisions, managing its investments or finances. Without that substance, the tax benefits you hope to get from using that jurisdiction, they're likely toast. GAR, PPT, treaty anti-abuse rules, they'll all come into play.
Let's make this concrete. The sources mentioned a practical case, the Netherlands holding play. Can you walk us through that? What was the situation?
Sure, so this involved a global manufacturing company based in India. They wanted to buy a smaller competitor located somewhere in the European Union.
Pretty standard expansion move.
Yeah, very common. But instead of the Indian parent buying the EU target directly, they decided to set up a holding company in the Netherlands first.
Okay.
So the structure became Indian parent owns Dutch Holdco, and Dutch Holdco owns the EU target company.
And why the Netherlands? What were the tax advantages they got from that structure?
The source points out a few key benefits. First, the tax treaty between India and the Netherlands. It's generally quite favorable for dividends flowing back to India. Using the Dutch route meant potentially lower withholding tax on those dividends compared to sending them directly from the EU target's country or maybe via another holding location.
Got it. Less tax leakage on the way back home.
Exactly. Second, a huge attraction of the Netherlands is its participation exemption regime. Basically, this meant the Dutch holding company generally didn't have to pay Dutch corporate tax on the dividends it received from its EU subsidiary.
Wow.
And importantly, it also meant if the Dutch company later sold the shares of the EU target, any capital gain would likely be exempt from Dutch tax too.
Okay, so zero tax on dividends coming in and potentially zero tax on gains if they sell later, all at that Dutch holding level. That's pretty powerful for preserving value.
It really is.
Yeah.
And third, just generally, having that Dutch entity often made the overall process of getting profits out of the EU operations and back to India smoother and more tax efficient, because the Netherlands has such an extensive network of tax treaties itself alongside its domestic rules. It acted as a sort of tax-efficient hub.
That case really does show how these, seemingly technical choices can translate into real dollars saved. It validates that value lever idea.
Absolutely. It shows smart structuring isn't just theory, it directly impacts the deal's bottom line and the long-term financial health of the whole group.
Now, you mentioned earlier there's a common mistake, a pitfall that trips companies up. What is it?
Yeah, one of the big ones highlighted is overlooking the complexities around deferred taxes, especially how they interact with goodwill and other intangibles, particularly in asset deals.
Deferred taxes sounds ominous, like a bill lurking in the future.
Well, it can be. So remember, in an asset deal, the buyer often gets that step up in the tax basis of the assets they bought.
Right. Allows for more depreciation later. Good for the buyer.
Good for the buyer, yes. They get a future tax benefit from those larger deductions. But here's the flip side. That same step up in value often creates a deferred tax liability on the seller's side.
How does that work?
It sort of represents the tax the seller would have eventually paid on the difference between the asset's book value and its sale value. But now that future tax obligation is effectively crystallized by the deal structure, giving the buyer the step up.
Okay, hold on. So the buyer gets a future tax break, but the seller gets hit with a future tax liability that's created by the structure of the deal itself.
That's often the dynamic. And if this deferred tax liability, this DTL, isn't properly calculated, understood by both sides, and factored into the negotiations into the actual price, well, you get a big mismatch.
Yeah, I can see that.
The buyer might be valuing their future tax shield highly, thinking they got a great deal. But if the seller suddenly realizes they have this large DTL eating into their net cash proceeds, the deal economics look very different from their perspective. It messes up pricing, and it affects the buyer's balance sheet post-closing too.
That sounds like something you absolutely need to model out very carefully way before you sign on the dotted line.
Oh, absolutely. It's a critical piece of due diligence and structuring that needs expert eyes on it early on.
Okay, so given all this complexity, the laws, the structuring choices, these pitfalls like deferred tax, how do experts like the team at Valuecent approach this? The source material laid out a sort of three-phase method.
Yeah, they advocate for a very structured, proactive process. It starts with phase one, diagnose the deal.
Diagnose. What's involved there?
It's really about getting under the hood. Understanding the why behind the deal, the commercial logic. Who are the players? What do their current ownership and tax situations look like? Where are they based? You need to analyze the proposed deal type asset or share. How's it being funded? And crucially, what tax red flags popped up during the initial due diligence?
So the goal is basically mapping the terrain, spotting the tax landmines, and maybe the opportunities right at the start.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You can't design a solution until you fully understand the specific problem, the specific context of this deal. It's about identifying those risks and structural options up front.
Okay, makes sense. Which then leads logically into phase 2. Design the tax structure.
Right. This is where the bespoke, tax-efficient plan gets built. And it has to do two things simultaneously. One, it must align with the overall business strategy for the merged company. Two, it absolutely has to comply with all those complex rules we talked about, BEPS, GAR, CFC, substance requirements, the works.
So what are the key components you're designing here?
Things like choosing the best jurisdiction for any holding company, if one's needed, mapping out the financing flows to be efficient, developing a clear strategy for handling deferred taxes and goodwill, making sure the whole structure has genuine economic substance.
And transfer pricing kits in here too, I imagine, making sure internal charges are right.
Definitely. Aligning the substance of your operations with your transfer pricing policies is crucial during design. You need to ensure that transactions between related companies post-deal are priced correctly, reflecting where value is actually created. It reinforces the substance argument. The whole goal of this design phase is to maximize the after-tax value, but in a way that's robust and totally compliant.
Okay, so you've diagnosed, you've designed the optimal structure. Then comes phase 3, deliver execution and integration. Sounds like making it happen and making it stick.
Precisely. The plan's no good if it doesn't get implemented properly, right? And it doesn't stop at closing. This phase covers embedding all those tax elements into the legal agreements for the deal itself. Then, post-merger, it's about the practical stuff. Actually setting up the legal entities correctly, making sure they operate with enough substance to claim treaty benefits, building efficient processes for getting profits from the operating businesses up to the holding company and back to the parent.
And planning the integration from a tax perspective, too.
Yes, creating a clear roadmap for tax reporting, compliance, managing tax risks during that often chaotic integration period. And documentation is key throughout this phase.
Documentation for
everything. Internally, for managing the structure properly, externally, for proving your case to tax authorities, to auditors, sometimes years down the line. The goal here is smooth execution and ensuring the tax structure works sustainably for the long haul.
It's definitely not just a one-off task at closing, then. It's ongoing. Okay, let's try and pull this all together. If you had to boil it down, what's the absolute core message from these sources about M&A tax structuring?
The message is loud and clear, really. Tax is not just some back-office detail in M&A. It's fundamental, it's strategic, it's a value lever, and it needs to be at the table right from the very beginning of any deal discussion.
And getting it right isn't just about saving a bit of tax. It's about actively creating and protecting shareholder value. We're talking potentially millions added to the bottom line.
Exactly. And the flip side is just as important. If you underestimate it, if you ignore the tax side, it can silently undermine the whole deal, potentially destroying huge amounts of the value you expected to gain.
So the key takeaway from this deep dive, drawing on those insights from Ravi Manga and Valuecent, really seems to be proactive. Make tax structuring a strategic tool, a value lever, right from day one of any M&A process.
Yeah. Turn what could be a major risk into a source of competitive advantage.
It really highlights how much hidden value or potential loss is wrapped up in these deals, doesn't it? Especially, as you mentioned, in areas like the lower middle market, where maybe the margins are tighter and optimizing every single aspect is absolutely crucial for success.
It's a powerful, often unseen force in the transaction.
So, maybe a final thought for everyone listening. If strategic tax structuring really can swing deal value by millions, what does that imply for how your organization looks at deals? How you evaluate them, price them, approach them right from the earliest conversations? Should that tax expertise be sitting right alongside the strategy and finance folks from the get-go?
The material we looked at certainly makes a very strong case for exactly that kind of early integrated approach.
Definitely food for thought. And as the source insights suggest, for anyone involved in M&A, whether you're leading deals, advising, or just trying to understand how value gets built and kept well, getting a handle on these tax principles seems critical. Leveraging expertise to make tax a strategic asset, not just a headache, seems like very valuable knowledge indeed.
It's knowledge that pays dividends, quite literally sometimes.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive into the often silent but crucial world of M&A tax structuring. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thinking of exiting your business or taking on a private equity partner to help you grow faster? BizNexus has you covered. Tap into our network of thousands of best-fit investors, acquirers, and proven M&A advisors, and we'll help you begin the relationship confidentially on your terms, your timeline. Learn more at biznexus.com.